Above and Beyond is an extraordinary documentary that tells the story of Machal. It's a ragtag unit of men from around the world, volunteers, many World War II veterans from the United States who came to the state of Israel to lay the foundation for the Israeli Air Force. These men were prepared to risk everything, their citizenship, their lives, to join the fight for freedom, independence, and help bring about the 2,000-year dream of returning to our homeland. Now, put aside for a moment the visions you have of today's powerful IDF or Israeli Air Force. These pilots flew American and German planes junked after World War II. Many of them, incredibly, were outfitted in discarded Nazi flight suits because those kinds of amenities were scarce. But despite these limitations, these pilots, through deception and through skill, were able to convince those they were fighting against that they posed a far more significant risk than they actually did. And in doing so, they helped turn the tide of the war in 1948. They were exceptionally heroic individuals, each and every one of them. Take, for example, Milt Rubenfeld. Milt was born in Peekskill, New York. He was a civilian pilot who would go on to join the Royal Air Force. Fun party fact for you, by the way. Milt Rosenfeld is the father of Pee Wee Herman. All right? I said this yesterday. Don't let this be the only thing you remember from this sermon. All right? He flies in the Royal Air Force. He eventually joins the United States Air Force, the Army Air Force, once we joined the war. In 1948, the HaShanah, the predecessor of the IDF, had set up an agency in America in hopes of recruiting experienced pilots to join the HaShanah Air Service. Rubenfeld was approached by an individual named Hyman Shechtman, one of HaShanah's chief representatives, and asked if he would join the struggle for Israel, in Israel. Rubenfeld agreed immediately. On his first mission, after successfully taking out several tanks and armored vehicles, his plane was damaged in a dogfight with an Egyptian Spitfire, and Rubenfeld crash-landed in the Mediterranean. As he swam ashore, he was getting ready to walk on dry land. The Jewish farmers there were shooting at him. They had no idea that there was anyone flying planes for the state of Israel, and they thought he was an Arab pilot. Rubenfeld, who spoke no Hebrew or Yiddish, and I'm telling you this is a true story, he shouted the only thing he knew so that the Israeli farmers would recognize him. And he screams at the top of his lungs as he's coming out of the water, "Shabbos, gefilte fish! Shabbos, gefilte fish!" And he lived another day. It's a remarkable story. Even as I tell you the story right now, I wonder what inspired them, these men, to go above and beyond and join this fight. Remember, they fought in World War II. The odds of surviving as airmen weren't great, and they managed to come out alive. They didn't plan on making the land of Israel their home. Most of them, all of them, returned to America after the War of Independence. Most of them weren't Jewishly observant. They weren't ardent Zionists. They didn't speak the language. They didn't share what we would call today any cultural literacy with the Israelis. So what inspired men like Milt Rubenfeld to risk their lives, travel around the world, and defend the Jewish people? And the answer comes from one of the most powerful narratives in the Torah that we read recently. in the book of Deuteronomy, having just prevailed in 2 wars of self-defense, poised to enter the promised land, the tribes of Reuben and Gad approach Moses and tell him that they want to stay on the east side of the Jordan River, outside of the land of Israel. Now you need to appreciate the moment, the drama of this moment. The Israelites had been wandering through the wilderness for 40 years. They were about to come to an end, this wandering. The dream of the promised land was within reach. It was within sight. And they go to Moses, who, by the way, is denied the one thing that he wants, which is to enter the promised land. These 2 tribes come to him, essentially saying it would be better for their economic interests, read cattle, if they remained outside the land. And Moses says the following to them: should your brothers go to war and you stay here? We're at war. We're going to cross this river and we will be in the fight for our lives. And you want to stay on this side of the Jordan, abandoning your brothers and your sisters now. Thousands of years ago, Moses challenged the tribes of Reuben and Gad and challenged their sense of collective responsibility. 75 years ago, Milt Rubenfeld and his fellow pilots heard the call. My question to you this morning is simple. Do you hear that call today? Do you hear that resounding voice of Moses calling to you to stand in solidarity with the people of Israel? Because I fear that today, that call is being muted, ignored, replaced, muted by voices that condemn Israel when the winds of war demand that the Jewish state defend itself, muted by voices that question the legitimacy of Israel in the international community, replaced by voices of anti-Zionists who challenge the premise that a Jewish state needs to exist at all. Despite the fact that the majority of Jews support the land of Israel, I hear these voices, and they're loud. I hear them in respected Jewish organizations like Avodah, a well-known Jewish social justice organization that does great work. Last year, they hired and fired an individual for a temporary social media position who on Twitter referred to Zionists as genocidal freaks, called all Zionists extremely ugly and all other kinds of horrible things about people who support the land of Israel. 150 alumni of Avodah called out and condemned the organization for capitulating to the pressure to fire this individual. That's a quote. They wanted the organization to actually repent and pay severance to this almost employee. I hear these voices in the rabbinical schools, where in May of 2021, while Israel was fighting in Gaza, a number of students from across the denominations signed onto a letter lamenting and describing the suffering of Palestinians both during the war and under occupation. And of course, they were suffering. But what the letter remained silent about was the suffering of Israelis, of Jews, or the tyranny of Hamas. There was no expression of Ahavat Yisrael, a love for the people of Israel, or the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in our homeland. Our future rabbis from across the board, our future leaders of the Jewish community, unable to speak in language that affirms their love for the Jewish people. I hear these voices in the universities we support, the places where we send our children to study. And while not every campus is on fire with anti-Zionism or attacks on Israel, the number of incidents in just the last few years is astounding. Incidents that lead Jewish students to question their place on campus, to conceal their pro-Israel identities. Here's one example. In 2021, at the University of Vermont, a teaching assistant suggests on Twitter that it would be good and funny to lower the grades of Zionist students in her class. She also encouraged students to cyberbully students who support Israel. Or on the same campus, in May of 2021, a student-run club named UVM Empowering Survivors, a group that encourages students to share stories about sexual assault, stated that they would block any Jewish Zionist, student from following their Instagram account. Now, this is news now because the president of UVM just issued a statement recently about these incidents that was widely condemned by most major Jewish organizations as insufficient. How can we expect these students, our children, to stand with Israel when, according to the Brandeis Center, not affiliated with Brandeis University, by the way, Jewish students have expressed fear about identifying publicly as Jewish or report hiding their Jewish identity and have considered transferring out of UVM due to the hostile environment towards Jews? My children tell me of friends with thick Jewish identities, friends who are identifiably Jewish in their lives, who hide their Israeli flags in their dorm rooms, or refer to Israel as Israel/Palestine so as not to be labeled, God forbid, a Zionist. A call from Moses that echoes so loudly for me, for so many of us, is silenced by intimidation and hatred for Jews and the Jewish state. And I only gave you one example. There are so many more. In addition, ideas like Orientalism, postmodernism, intersectionality have been weaponized to create a hostile environment for Jews and freeze them out of social justice organizations and campus groups that align with many of our children's values, values that they learned in our homes and our synagogues. And unless they suppress their anti-Zionist instincts or declare themselves to be anti-Zionists, they will remain excluded and stigmatized. As Adam Hoffman says or wrote in the most 2 volumes ago of the Sapir Journal, yesterday Jews were mocked for being oppressed. Today Jews are denigrated for being successful. We've lost all the political lottery once again. And what happens on college campuses no longer remains on campus. When these ideas are broadcast through the mainstream, through social media, you can understand why Jews who didn't disavow their Zionist credentials were excluded, for example, from the Women's March, or marches supporting a number of issues around LGBTQ acceptance and other causes that many Jews, many of us, would naturally align with. I worry for our kids. I worry for us. The social pressure to conform is intense. And the question is, what are we and our children supposed to do? First, we need to make sure that our children understand the resources that are available to them on the college campus. As Rachel Fish says in her excellent article in Sapir, Chabad and Hillel recognize they can no longer be bystanders in this challenge. It's no longer just about serving cholent on Shabbat. It's no longer just making sure that kids have a place to pray, she says. These organizations realize that they have a responsibility to help students face and navigate these challenges, these difficult situations on campus. So Hillel creates the campus initiative, the campus climate initiative. Chabad works to train professionals, to build relationships with faculty and administration, helping students understand their rights on campus and work through these sometimes difficult situations. Second, I've been through the college search enough times with my own children, and I'm right in the middle of it right now. to know there are many competing values that go into choosing a school. And when going through the checklist, I encourage you to think about the political environment of a particular school and how that environment relates to Jewish life and Israel on campus. Now, I know that many of the schools that we consider for our children have challenges in this regard, and I tread lightly here. But when we select the schools that we do for our children, we shouldn't be surprised by what they encounter on campus. Third, we must hold our institutions accountable. When universities or organizations with whom we affiliate begin the conversation with the question of whether or not Israel has a right to exist or not, or professors in the classroom accuse soldiers in the IDF of raping and murdering Palestinian women, we need to do more than speak up. We need to pressure these institutions with whatever we have at our disposal and say enough is enough. You want my time? You want my leadership? You want my resources? You need to get your house in order. Create, cultivate, and nurture an environment where Jewish students and adults can feel safe, hold their heads up high, and proudly assert the many layers of their Jewish identities. And finally, so much of this comes down to education. When it comes to Israel, we are failing. All of us, you, me, our kids, we are bombarded with words like occupation, colonialists, oppressors. We get bogged down in the conflict and think that our only job is to prepare our kids to defend Israel from this conflict, as if Israel is only about the conflict. We know it is so much more. And it pains me that we put our children in a position where they must defend their commitment to the state of Israel. And I want to tell you something. You don't have to defend anything. First, there are trained professionals and organizations that can do it a lot better. Second, Israel is a fact on the ground. It's home to almost half the Jews living in the world today. And in a few years, the majority of Jews will make their home in Israel. The story of our people will continue to be played out there, and it is beneath you to have to justify that existence. But here is what I do ask of you, all of you. I want you to know, as Rabbi Sachs says, that we are a people defined by history, that we, each one of us, are characters in the world's oldest continuous story, charged with writing its next chapter and handing it on to those who come after us. That means that we have to know the history. I want you to understand the historical condition of powerlessness that led to the emergence of political Zionism in the 19th century. I want you to understand the epic story of Israel in the 20th century, one of the great revolutionary movements ever. I want you to understand the miraculous return of a people to their homeland after thousands of years of yearning to do so. I want you to know that a new Jew, a new identity was created. An ancient language was revived. It was reborn. And today, millions of Israelis take for granted the fact that they speak the language of the Bible. I want you to know that because of the existence of the State of Israel, Jews no longer live in existential fear. In fact, it is the opposite. Despite obligatory army service, the stress of living in a dangerous neighborhood, and frequent wars, Israel ranks extraordinarily high on the world happiness scale, much higher, by the way, than the United States. So come learn with us. I'll be teaching a class this fall about the emergence of that new Jew, that new identity in Israeli society. will be teaching in the middle school and the high school units on Israel. And in the year when we celebrate Israel at 75, there will be countless opportunities to learn and experience the Jewish state together. Finally, I make no apologies about being a Zionist. But I also know that there are people here this morning, people who are members of this community, who see things differently. Where I see miracles and blessings, you might see flaws and missed opportunities. So I offer you one more thought. And here, I particularly want to speak to the high school and college students, other young adults who are here with us. When thinking about our relationship with Israel, I ask you to consider what it means to truly love someone. We don't love someone because they are perfect. Danny Gordis talks about this in one of his articles. In fact, we love someone in spite of their imperfections. And what is this holiday about, if not standing in front of God, fully transparent, fully vulnerable, understanding that God doesn't expect perfection. God expects aspiration and the effort that we take to narrow that gap between the people we are and the people that we aspire to be in the year to come. Friends, loving a country is no different. It can best be described in what I'll call the tale of two Davids. King David was a flawed individual with blood on his hands. What happens to David? He becomes the progenitor of the Messiah. David Ben-Gurion, the man, the architect who built the Jewish state. Well, when you study that history that I want you to study, you'll learn that David Ben-Gurion was far from perfect. He said some things about immigrants from Arab countries that were deplorable. And yet today, when you fly into Israel, where do you land? You land at Ben-Gurion. There is a university named for him. In the words of Rabbi Gordis, Ben-Gurion was like the country. He did much to create, highly imperfect, terribly flawed, and extraordinary, all at the same time. Yes, it's hard to love imperfection. It takes patience, it takes understanding, but to do so is a sign of maturity, of mature love. It's the recognition that anything and everything we love is imperfect. It applies to family, it applies to friends, and it applies to our nation. Our challenge, knowing all that, is to give our love generously. Knowing this history, how can you not hear the voice of Moses calling out to you? This past August, that call was ringing in my ear. And I traveled to Israel for 4 days. It was my son's last day of active duty in the Israel Defense Forces. It's been 3 years. 3 years. The blip of COVID. And I wanted to be there as he cut his draft card, concluding this chapter in his life. One of the things I wanted to do while we were there was to drive a few hours south to Kibbutz Ketorah and visit what I think is one of the most inspiring places in all of Israel. It is a tree. A tree. And it's not just any tree. In the 60s, when they were excavating Masada, they discovered date pits from dates that the defenders of Masada had stockpiled thousands of years ago. Those seeds were placed in a drawer. They were discovered. They were placed in a drawer for 40 years, at which time an Israeli botanist, Elaine Soloway, planted one of them. And miraculously, a tree sprung forth from the earth. And that tree is called Methuselah. And this is the resurrected tree I wanted to visit. The first Judean date palm in 2,000 years. Can you think of a better symbol of Jewish hope, Jewish resilience, the miraculous rebirth of Jewish life in Israel than this tree? A better image to celebrate our rootedness to this land. As my son was preparing to begin a new chapter in his life, I wanted him to see this tree and to remind him of the ongoing wonder of this place that he calls home. But time was short. We just couldn't make a 6-hour trip happen. So instead, we did the simple things we were able to do as a result of the fact that this tree exists at all. Liot am chofshi be'artzenu. To be free Jews in the land. And we lived. We went to Minyan together. We went to the gym together. We spent Shabbat together. We walked the streets of Jerusalem together. It was a glorious 96 hours, one of my most treasured experiences in Israel. On the last day of this short trip, we picked up some fresh coffee and cake from the Shuk. We took a bus to an army base about a half hour outside of Jerusalem, and there we met up with some members of his platoon and 2 of his commanding officers. We sat on the floor of what was a disgusting army base. Makes my daughter's dorm room at Barnard look like the Four Seasons. And one of the officers brewed some coffee in his portable coffee brewing device that all these soldiers seem to have. We ate, and I listened to my thoroughly Israeli son share stories with his friends, thank his band of brothers for the opportunity to serve together with them, defending the Jewish people for the past 2 years and 8 months. It was as powerful a graduation ceremony as I've ever experienced. We headed back to Jerusalem, and we arrived. He needed to run and catch that unbelievable train that exists now between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. He needed to catch a train to his new home in Herzliya because the very next day he was beginning a several-week intensive math class in preparation for college at IDC in Herzliya, where he starts in October. We hugged. I gave him a blessing. I watched that view again of him running for his train, running towards his future. I turned around. I jumped on another miracle, the light rail in Jerusalem that runs from the train and bus station to Ben Yehuda, as I wanted to pick up a few things before I flew back to America. All the while, thinking of 2,000-year-old trees and the multitude of miracles that I just experienced in one moment of saying goodbye on the streets of Jerusalem. It was a moment filled with pride and envy. Pride at all he had accomplished, envy at how when he heard the call of Moses, well, he took it literally. And he chose to stand with his brothers and sisters, linking his own personal destiny to the destiny of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. I don't know when, but I am confident that one day my time will come when, like my son, I will call the land of Israel my home. Until that time, I will continue to hear that sacred call in a different way, an important way. And I know that as long as I am blessed to do the sacred work that I do, one of the pillars of my rabbinate will be to help you and to inspire you to hear that call as well. In the coming year, I wish you all a year of happiness and health, a year filled with shalom, of wholeness and of peace. And I wish you a year of reflection of how you might better hear the call of Moses. You will surely hear it differently than Milt Rubenstein. You'll hear it differently than Jacob Zuckerman. You'll hear it differently than I do. But please, hear that call. And wherever you stand, stand with Israel. Shana Tova.